I've been caught, but I'm keeping on check. And I've been taught, but I'm keeping on check. And I've been broken.
Good afternoon, good evening. You're back on Equal Footing. This is Dov Tuzman. A couple of interesting weeks there with Rabbi Simon Jacobson talking about hypocrisy in the rabbinate, a difficult subject. It especially hurts us as people who have faith as a central part of their lives when religious authorities or religious authority in general at a theoretical level seems to somehow be off kilter, not in line with the underlying spirit of our faith. At least it can seem that way. We're in that vein again tonight. As always in the show, we try to tackle subjects that cause us consternation. This isn't easy stuff. That's not the point of this show. It's casting a light on the darker spaces at times and allowing us to live a holistic life of faith that involves embracing the complex. In this case, we're going to talk about religious divorce, and specifically the phenomenon that happens in our community, particularly in the more observant ends of the Jewish community, where you have women that are kind of in limbo, that are not granted a divorce. And yes, in under traditional Jewish law, halacha, a man actually has to grant a woman divorce. And yes, I know we've talked about LGBTQ issues on the show, and we're not discounting the possibility of those types of relationships out there because we know they do exist. But tonight we're talking about halacha as it pertains to men and women, and particularly around the process of obtaining a get, a divorce document under Jewish religious law to obtain a divorce, and what happens when that isn't granted by the man. It's this phenomenon called Agunot or Agunot. These are women that are chained, literally. It's like the concept of being chained or anchored to a past life, to their pre-divorce status, because they can't remarry. You've probably heard about this in popular culture, but our point here is not to sensationalize, but to dig in around a solution to this problematic issue. It's been a problematic issue, by the way, for arguably thousands of years. There have been scholars in our faith who have been tackling this complex issue of the man granting a divorce, what happens when the woman is effectively in limbo when that divorce is not granted. I want to thank in advance a couple of wonderful guests who are ready to tackle the difficult. Let me start by introducing a new guest on Equal Footing, Keshet Star. Keshet is a lawyer. She's the CEO of the Organization for the Resolution of Agunot, or ORA. It's a nonprofit organization addressing the kind of Jewish divorce refusal that we just referred to as the Agunot. It's a crisis, and they address it on a case-by-case basis worldwide. So it's an advocacy organization, but actually works with individual women who are in this circumstance. At ORA, Keshet oversees this advocacy as well as early intervention initiatives designed to assist individuals seeking a Jewish divorce and prevention initiatives to eliminate abuse of the traditional Jewish divorce process. She's written for outlets like the Times of Israel, the Jewish Forward, Haaretz. She frequently presents on issues related to Jewish divorce, domestic abuse, and the intersection between civil and religious divorce processes. Keshet has authored an academic work focused on on the refusal of a get, or the Jewish divorce document, and domestic abuse. She's a Wexner Field Fellow. She's named one of the Jewish Week's 36 under 36. Just an amazing person. A graduate of the University of Michigan and the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Keshet, welcome to the program. It's great to have you on for the first time. Hopefully not the last. Can you hear us, Keshet?
Yes.
There you are. Welcome to Equal Footing. I'm going to introduce your, I don't know about sparring partner, but your talking partner here tonight, but she's been on the program before. She's a veteran, Rivka Slonim, Rebbitzin Rivka Slonim. She's the Associate Director of the Rohr Chabad Center of Jewish Student Life at Binghamton University. She co-founded that with her husband, Rabbi Aaron Slonim, many years ago. I won't say when, but decades ago. Rivka is a self-described Hasidic feminist. She's an internationally known lecturer and activist. She's the editor of Total Immersion, a mikveh anthology. She's been on the show talking about the mikveh before, as well as Bread and Fire, Jewish Women Find God in the Everyday. She recently co-authored Holy Intimacy, the Heart and Soul of Jewish Marriage. She serves on the editorial board of the Rohr Jewish Learning Institute, JLI, and on the executive boards of several other academies and institutes. She's a senior lecturer at Bais Chana Women International, an adult Jewish educational enterprise described as a university without walls. Rivka, welcome back.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Rivka, can you start out? There may be some listeners who are like, tonight's not for me. I don't really, I'm whatever. I'm reform. I'm conservative. I don't have to worry about this stuff. Can you speak to our perhaps less observant listeners and explain to them in brief what the principles are of religious marriage and the principles of religious divorce in like a really accessible way we can all understand?
I can only try to do that and try to do that as quickly as possible. I think we have to begin first and foremost by framing our discussion tonight about Jewish marriage and divorce within the larger context of Jewish life, law, and lore. And the reason I say that is because in our wider culture, marriage is perceived as a lifestyle choice. But within Judaism, marriage is considered a mandate, a mitzvah. That's a Hebrew word. That means a God-given commandment. Interestingly, and we'll come back to this, that is incumbent upon a man. And as with all other God-given commandments, there are rules that govern marriage, as well as rules that govern its dissolution and divorce. I lead with this because we postmoderns are accustomed to the rubric of marriage being more malleable. And interestingly, Elizabeth Gilbert points out in her book, Committed.
Speak for yourself, Rivka. I don't know if I'm a postmodern.
Okay, then. I will try to
I
do
love
that.
that. We postmoderns. I'm going to use that in the show.
So Gilbert points out she wrote this. Of course, I'm thinking a lot of your listeners have read her book or watched the movie Eat, Pray, Love. Mm-hmm. She has a less well-known book called Committed that's fascinated on the subject of marriage as a construct, and she points out that marital paradigms have always been changing over the centuries. In fact, they did so constantly and swiftly. And I feel like in our present day, that's all the more acute. We're raised with the possibility of choosing one of 2,000 breakfast cereals. That's only the cold ones. We expect everything to be customized to our likings and specifications. And Jewish law in general, and therefore Jewish marriage and Jewish divorce, doesn't quite work that way. So that's the first thing I would say.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the basic, because it's important to understand the dissolution of the institution. I think it's important to understand the constitution of the institution. And one of the things that's interesting about the Jewish and generally Abrahamic religious view on marriage is that its primary, correct me if I'm wrong, its primary purpose is procreation.
Well, you're wrong on that.
I'm wrong.
I think that's a very important purpose, but marriage, and yes, the hope and the prayer and the expectation is that in many, if not most cases, there will be children, but Jewish law sees value in the construct of the marital bond that transcends the fruit of that bond. So marriage in and of itself is considered one of the most important things. Now, specifically, to get closer to our subject tonight, and this is what's a little bit surprising and abrasive for us, okay, we're going to say moderns as opposed to postmoderns. Marriage within Torah, within Jewish law, is not a bilateral agreement. Like I mentioned earlier, it's a responsibility incumbent upon a Jewish man. Mm-hmm. The marriage is thus unilateral. A man consecrates his wife he gives her something called a ketubah, a marriage contract, which is actually the most ancient prenuptial agreement on record. And if and when the marriage should dissolve, he must give her a bill of divorce, known by its Aramaic name, a get.
Now, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but I think it's interesting for listeners to note that in the Talmud and in ancient kind of rabbinical Judaic wisdom, the man, there are a whole bunch of obligations that are set upon the man in marriage, some of which are, feel very archaic to even read today, but how, the portion of fruit and vegetables that are provided to the women each day, the sufficient, wood for cooking, this type of thing. There's a whole list of things from clothing to physical obligations to home and household, and they all are written in the framework of what the man needs to provide. I think that's interesting because it kind of flows from and is consistent with the idea of the man providing the ketubah, the marriage contract, and also the facilitating and granting the get, the marriage dissolution.
Correct. And you're right that reading the law surrounding ketubah, a lot of it does sound so archaic, and yet on the other hand, there are very important parts of it that are so progressive. For instance, I think certainly in ancient rubrics, but even today, I'm sad to say, a lot of men see sexual intimacy as their right, and it's almost like their wife's obligation. Whereas according to the ketubah, a man is obligated to give his wife sexual pleasure. It's his obligation and her privilege.
We've talked about that before in a program.
But we digress.
But I think it's related because there are, I'm going to ask you guys in a moment of the kind of the reasons that are typically kind of where gets are withheld and what the reasons are, but there's at least a popular kind of, bias out there, or stereotype is the word I'm looking for, that it's like Jewish men who are not kind of getting the intimacy that they need from their wife. And that's certainly not supported in Jewish law.
Nope. I mean, if she withholds it and does so in a malicious manner for no good reason at all, that could be reason for him to start divorce proceedings. But then again, if he withholds it from her, that's reason for her to start divorce proceedings. So intimacy is seen as very important and critical. It's interesting because, Jewish law does conjure a model of a ketubah, where a woman comes into marriage and she says she has her own assets, she has her own resources, and she'll take care of her own food and medicinal needs, her clothing, her her shelter. She doesn't need her husband to do any of this, and she will hold on to her own assets. And that can be a halacha ketubah. But if a woman comes in and says, "Oh, you can take care of my food and my medicinal needs, my clothing, my shelter, but I'll take care of my own sexual needs," no, thank you. There is no such Jewish marriage contract because intimacy is seen as so critical to their relationship. But in any case, if the marriage should dissolve, a civil divorce is necessary, but is not enough from the perspective of Jewish law for their souls to be extricated from that union. Only a get can do that.
So the civil divorce, the secular divorce process, which can be different in different jurisdictions, depending on where that Jewish couple is living in the world, is necessary but insufficient. And this, Keshit, is where you step in. So as both a lawyer and a religious activist, we're going to need to take our first break in a moment. But do you do both? Do you work with couples on both the secular divorce and the religious divorce process?
Essentially, a lot of what we do at ORA is help integrate the two streams together. Very often what's happening is that someone might be getting one stream of advice from their rabbi and another stream of advice from their attorney, and if they try to follow all the advice at the same time, it cancels each other out. It doesn't work. And so part of what we do, we're not representing anyone, either in court or in Beit Din, in a religious court, but what we do instead is help people figure out how do we integrate these systems together so that you're in a position of strength strategically and the systems aren't working against each other.
Got it. We're going to get into that. We've covered the marriage part. Now we're going to spend most of the rest of the program talking about the divorce process, because that is the focus here in the religious divorce process. I want to give out the numbers quickly before our first break. The number to call in is 718-303-9090. That's 718-303-9090. We are live on the air. We're here with Keshet Star and Rivka Slonim talking about religious divorces, and specifically the unfortunate phenomenon of women who are kind of in a limbo state and not granted the religious divorce, otherwise known as Agunot. Call in, share your personal stories, your opinions, your experiences in this area. You don't have to say your name. You can do so anonymously. You can also text or WhatsApp in a question or comment. That's a different number. Please don't call this number. This is just for SMS or WhatsApp, 917-428-4062, and we'll try to get to it on the air, 917-428-4062, and we'll be right back.
Sitting here in limbo, but I know it won't be long. Sitting here in limbo, like a bird.
Oh, that's one of my favorite musical choices on the show in years. Thank you, Leah. Okay, let's honor a sponsor for a long time now on this network for this program and other programs. It's Manhattan Medical. Manhattan Medical, like this show, tries to tackle difficult subjects without any shame, trying to get to resolution. In their case, it's around erectile dysfunction. It is not something to be ashamed of. It affects around 2/3 of men in their lifetime. It can be emotionally painful and obviously affects the intimate dynamic with couples. Manhattan Medical is particularly sensitive to the needs of the community that this program addresses. You don't have to be in Manhattan. You don't even have to be in the New York area. If you're anywhere in the United States, you can get help from Manhattan Medical around their innovative, surgery-free, painless approach to solving erectile dysfunction. Most people think that it's only about those expensive blue pills. Many people cannot use that solution because of comorbidities and side effects. Manhattan Medical utilizes a new, effective therapy. When I say new, it's been around for a long time in Europe, proven to work. It's been around in Canada as well for some time. It's new to the United States, and it's a therapy for ED called Gainswave. It has no side effects for the vast majority of patients, wonderful results and enduring results that end up being a lot less costly than being constantly using pills. I'm going to give out the number for Manhattan Medical's cure for erectile dysfunction, 888-ED-CURE-9. That's 888-ED-CURE-9. I'll give out the numbers fully in numbers, not letters, in a moment. I just want to say before we wrap up that if you tell Manhattan Medical that you heard about their ED therapy on Equal Footing, on this radio program, you get a free consultation. And that's a $250 value. You won't get that if you just call in on your own. I'm going to give out the number one more time. Manhattan Medical, mention you heard about it on Equal Footing and get a $250 free consultation for their ED cure therapy. 888-332-8739. That's 888-332-8739.
I've been caught, but I'm keeping on to. I've been told.
All right, we've entitled this program Living in Limbo. And Keshet Star, you work with women, Jewish women, that are in this kind of limbo state. What's that about? To educate us on the concept, or the reality, I should say, of Agunot.
Absolutely. So essentially, as we discussed, in Jewish law, you need a Jewish divorce that's totally separate from the civil divorce. So even if you are divorced under the laws of the state, you still need this separate Jewish divorce. And what happens without it is that you're really stuck. You can't remarry within the community, and you can't even go out on a date, which a lot of people don't realize. You're considered to be just as married as you were on your wedding day. And what that does to people is it creates a situation where all the stress and the limbo of the divorce ends up carrying on not only for the active part of the divorce, but it can go on for years and even decades. And as with anything difficult, when you're in it, you don't know when it's going to end. So it's not like you know this is going to take 3 years or this is going to take 6 years. For all you know, this could be the rest of your life, and you're trying to live your life with this huge question mark and this tremendous uncertainty.
Yeah. And I just want to emphasize, or let me put it as a question, because I am not an expert here. Keshet, is this a modern day problem, or has this been kind of a sensitive issue in our community for a long time? Measured in a Jewish sense, meaning centuries and millennia.
This has been going on for a very long time, and as you go through the Talmud, there are fascinating conversations about this. What I will say, though, is that it looks a little different in every social context, in every legal context, in every cultural moment. So the types of issues we're dealing with now are not exactly the same as what people were dealing with 200 years ago, but they were dealing with it. This is a problem that's been a consistent challenge in different ways throughout Jewish history.
Yeah,
I just want to jump in and give your listeners kind of some context or some examples of what Keshet is speaking about. In yesteryear, the most common form of an Agunot, a woman who was chained to her past or to her dead marriage, was the woman whose husband perhaps died in war but wasn't 100% identified, or went abroad for business or some other reason and went missing. And for this reason, since ancient times, Jewish men were counseled to write bills of divorce for their wives when they went to war or expected to be gone for a lengthy period of time. Much more recently, we had tremendous pains taken to identify, and I'm sorry about the graphic nature of this, but fragments of bodies that were incinerated in 9/11. I can't even begin to tell you the hours and hours and hours of work that went into identifying that so women would be freed and would not become agunot. Because according to Jewish law, you need certain knowledge that the husband is dead or there needs to be a bill of divorce. So I think that's what Keshet's talking about when she talks about how it looks different. Today it's much more about the recalcitrant man, the man who decides he's going to withhold the get. Why? Well, he recognizes that this system, which actually was enacted to safeguard a woman's dignity and station, can be weaponized. And he might do that in the hopes of extorting money, custodial rights, other demands, or just because he's a sadist and he can, and he wants her to suffer. It's completely awful. And that's why a woman in this situation is referred to as an agunah. She's chained.
Yeah. And this problem has a long and painful history. I don't want to shy away from the tough stuff. I mean, is it true that, I'll direct this to both of you, is it true that part of the issue here is this rabbinic law that we've talked about in other contexts on this program, that women are ineligible to testify as a witness? And this, that you're kind of referring to in 9/11. So it makes it, is that like an added layer of complexity? It's a law that is problematic for a lot of people for other reasons as well.
Keshet's the one with the.
And when I say law, I mean halakha. I mean Jewish religious law.
I know, and I think she has, the real-time experience. But it's my understanding that that's not the main issue here at all.
Keshet,
and I would echo. Yeah, I would echo that. What I think is an important piece to realize, and this is exactly the kind of tough thing that's not fun or comfortable to discuss, but one of the layers to this is that under Jewish law, if a woman whose marriage hasn't formally ended, whether it's because, husband went on a business trip and, on a boat somewhere and never came back, or because he's refusing a get, if she were to then start a new relationship and have children in that relationship, those children would be considered illegitimate under Jewish law, and they would not be able to marry freely within the Jewish community. So there's a real generational piece here. And many women, regardless of what they might want for themselves, are also very conscious about making sure that their future children have options available to them and aren't barred from joining certain communities. So I would say that aspect of Jewish law, I think, is a huge motivating factor here, more so than the witness piece.
And does this matter as much outside of Israel as it matters in Israel? I know a couple, even as of now, we have two listeners asking that question, that this is a more operative issue in Israel than outside. Do you want to address that, Keshet? Are these listeners right?
Sure. And the question is the issue specifically of illegitimacy or overall the Agunot issue?
It sounds like overall, but go for both angles.
Sure. Yeah. So I would say the challenge is really similar in Israel and outside. It's just flipped. So in Israel, there's no separation between church and state. That means whether you're observant or not, you have to follow these rules. So you have women that are Agunot for decades who aren't observant in the first place, and that's a real challenge. And the Israeli system can sometimes be slow and bureaucratic in a way that can make it very difficult to process these cases. Outside of Israel, we almost have the opposite problem, which is that if you go to a Jewish court in the United States and they say, Mr. Goldberg, you need to give your wife a get, and he says, no, thank you, there is not a whole lot that they can legally do to then encourage this person to cooperate with the get process. And so the challenge we have in the diaspora is that we don't have great enforcement options. And a huge part of our work at ORA is building more enforcement options, because a lot of it comes down to how can you motivate someone to do something that they don't want to do when you're in a legal environment where there's not a whole lot you can do to enforce what you would like them to do.
That's really interesting. I didn't think of that. So like in Israel, you could have someone who's a Jewish culturally, but maybe doesn't even practice at all, or maybe doesn't even believe in God, who does Aliyah and is trying to get a divorce, and for whatever reason, maybe there's a manipulation of the system, or there's obstinacy, and does not obtain a get, and they're an Agunah, even though they may not really identify with religious law elsewise in their life.
Absolutely.
And then you've got religious, if I understand you correctly, you've got probably very frum communities, observant communities here that feel like, heck, this is too easy. It's too easy for people to get the civil divorce, and the religious law isn't important enough.
Absolutely. And one important thing to realize is that when someone is withholding a get for a long time, they're violating Jewish law. They are not in compliance with what Jewish law demands of them. But just like we don't put people in prison for eating bacon cheeseburgers in the United States, even though that is very much not kosher, we also can only do so much to someone who's violating Jewish law in this manner. And so it's a violation of Jewish law. It's not in the spirit of Jewish law. The question is, what kinds of teeth do you have to address when people are violating these laws?
Interesting. We're going to take our first break in a moment, but there's a caller on line 3 here who's been patient and I think has a question along these lines. Caller, can you hear me?
I hear you.
Welcome to Equal Footing.
Thank you. I want to expand upon what's happening in Israel. That first of all, if a man does not want to give a get, and it's been so deemed that he's supposed to give a get, they can take away his passport, they can throw him in prison, many things can be done against him, but he can still refuse because it has to be done with free will. Also, there are women who do not want to receive a get. They are also put under certain pressure. This is very important information. At the very beginning, I wanted to correct one thing. All you need is religious divorce in Israel. You don't need a secular. Like you said, religious and secular at the very beginning. Let me point out one
wait, caller, pause for a second. Keshet and Rivka, is he right?
The get has to be willingly given by the husband and willingly received by the wife. So the process can absolutely fail on either side, and our organization works with some men whose wives are not accepting the get. That being said, it is for us about 95% one way, 5% the other way. So the numbers are really not even from what we see. But again, it can absolutely happen on both directions. And in terms of the Israel piece, Israel does have a secular process as well. But it is still true that for someone who's not observant, there's no separate secular divorce that they can pursue that's outside of the religious divorce. Their personal status is still determined by halacha if they're Jewish and they live in the state of Israel.
Gotcha. Caller, quickly.
One very important thing regarding the illegitimate children. If a man and wife were married not according to Jewish law, Rabbi Henkin says even if they were married in City Hall, they should give a get. Rav Moshe Feinstein says you don't have to give a get, but I will say I recommend it because he bent his will to Rabbi Henkin. But still, there are cases where Rabbi Feinstein allowed, I know a case where the wife was drunk and she didn't want to receive a get, the man was able to marry. In other words, it's very, very important because you will not have illegitimate children if they were married by a Reform rabbi and there were not witnesses there. I will tell you a case. I work in India, and in India I nullified 2 marriages. We tried to give a get. They didn't want to take it. I wrote out a special document. They were able to remarry without a get, according to Shuvas HaRashba, according to Rabbi David Feinstein. In other words, it has to be a religious, authentic ceremony with witnesses in order for her to be called Eishes Ish, a married woman. He's a married man married to her. If it's not according to strict Jewish law, according to Rabbi Feinstein, then it is not. And if somehow they get a civil divorce and they don't get a religious divorce and she remarries, the children are not mamzerim. They're not illegitimate children.
Interesting.
That's the reality.
By the way, caller, do you want to identify yourself? I should have asked you if you want to introduce yourself.
I go to India a lot, and I have to be beneath the radar. But my name is Shlomo. Okay,
but you're a rabbi.
I was there before Chabad got there, and I was able to
Shlomo, Rabbi, it's great that you call because actually right after the break we're going to talk about the role of the rabbis in the process. I appreciate your call. So let's take a break. We'll be right back with Rivka Slonim and Keshet Star. Living in limbo, the unfortunate and tragic dynamic, really, of women that are in a state where they can't remarry, not obtaining a divorce document under Jewish religious law. We'll be right back.
Listen to the wind blow, watch the sun rise. Running in the shadows, damn your love, damn your life.
Equal Footing with Dove Tusman is sponsored by MDCS Dermatology, your experts in skincare. With 2 Manhattan locations and 4 offices in Long Island, including Plainview and Commack, the dermatologists and skincare surgeons at MDCS are proud to be affiliated with the Albert Einstein College of Medicine and New York Presbyterian Hospital. So schedule your next skin exam in one of MDCS's convenient New York area locations. To make an appointment, go to www.mdcs.live or call 212-661-DERM. That's 212-661-3376. You could even schedule a virtual video visit with MDCS's board-certified dermatologists from the comfort and safety of your own home. So go to www.mdcs.live or call 212-661-3376. And don't forget to mention Equal Footing for 15% off all cosmetic procedures.
I've been caught, but I'm keeping on check. I've been told.
So right before the break, we had, Rabbi Shlomo call in, and actually I wanted to ask you both, what is the role of the Beis Din, the Jewish ecclesiastical court, and rabbis specifically, or positive or negative, in this process and in resolving the Agunot issue?
Well, Rabbi Shlomo threw a lot of information at all of us very, very quickly. So first, to more generally address your question of what is the role of the rabbis. So while I began with saying that there are rules and halakha is understood as being rooted in divine will, but I will say that one of the most audacious ideas in Jewish theology is the partnership of man with God, which is most prominently exhibited in what is referred to as the oral tradition. And the specifics of Jewish practice have evolved and continue to do so to some extent. But that's very different than saying it's completely malleable. It's not like clay in the hands of a sculptor. So regarding the laws of divorce, sadly, because the way it's set up gives rise to a very real vulnerability on the part of a woman, there have always been attempts to address this. Beginning as early as the 5th century, before the Common Era, there were already changes to marriage and divorce processes intended to address this. And this continued to unfurl through the periods of the Tanoim and the Amoraim. And the biggest change probably came roughly 1,000 years ago with Rabbi Gershom, often referred to as Rabbi Gershom Meor Hagola, in the year 1000 of the Common Era. And he enacted a decree that severely limited the power of a husband to divorce his wife against her will. Mm-hmm. And the process of attending to this vulnerability and the wish to protect women is something that has continued. It was always taken very, very seriously. For instance, the Code of Jewish Law prohibits a Jewish court from judging or operating in any capacity on the Sabbath. But the Mishnah Brura, a very important book of Jewish code, rules that in the case of a recalcitrant husband, it's permitted for a Jewish court to lock him up on the Sabbath so he will not escape. We also can't talk about the subject without mentioning, or at least bring in for a moment, Maimonides' iconic ruling on the subject. Of course, I think this was spoken of quickly earlier, that a man has to give the divorce of his own free will, and yet Maimonides ruled that if a husband refuses to do so, you basically bring him in and beat him up till he says, I want to do this.
But we've had Rabbi Simon Jacobson on the last couple of weeks, and we had a couple of callers that actually called on this issue of the problem of the Agunot. And Keshet, it sounds good what Rivka is saying. It sounds like there's strong kind of sense of women's rights in the situation, and there's I guess empathy about the issue in the rabbinate. But there's a lot of stuff out there around cases that are not resolved, and it's extremely painful. People are sometimes in situation for decades. So can you talk to us about the intransigent cases? Like when are Agunot cases not resolved, and what can be done to break the impasse?
And Keshet, speak about what has emerged as the single most effective prophylactic, let's just say, safeguard.
Absolutely. So I will say, to give you a sense of what these cases look like, when a couple's getting divorced, it's not uncommon, again, to have a hostile divorce. No one is their ex-spouse's biggest fan. That's very common. But in some divorces, they go to this territory of kind of an extreme high conflict divorce. And these are terrible. They're terrible for kids when they're involved. They're terrible for communities. There are many communities that have been split up by terrible divorces where everyone chooses sides. They really have a fallout. And especially in these types of divorces, it's not uncommon for the get to become sort of the sticking point and a source for revenge. We also really see the get as a form of domestic abuse. And it's usually not the first time there's domestic abuse. It's usually a relationship where there is a pattern for a long time of one person wanting to hold on to the other person and to dominating.
For those that are tuning in late, the get is the divorce dissolution document under Jewish religious law.
Yes, absolutely. And so when there's been a history and a pattern of control, that often, again, goes into the divorce process. And the get, while I don't think any of us who are, faithful Jewish people, we don't believe that it was intended to be used this way. But in practice, the get can sometimes be an opportunity for an abuser to hold on to control. And what we find is that especially with these terrible cases, they can go on for years, easily 2, 3, 5 years. Not uncommon, 10 years, 20 years. And again, you don't have a tremendous amount of cases that are going to that 10, 15, 20-year mark, but they're out there. There's not only 2 of them. And because people know that this can happen, that creates a huge anxiety and can really impact the way that people negotiate and the way that they function in the divorce process.
Not to get too wonky, but from a legal perspective, that creates kind of a moral hazard because the man knows that he's got that arrow in the quiver, even if it's not used.
Precisely.
Absolutely. Yeah. And for that reason, and I'm so glad you kind of teed me up for this, Rivka, one thing that we advocate for very enthusiastically at ORA is for couples to sign what's called a halachic prenuptial agreement. And it's a prenup, but it's not the kind of prenup that makes you think of Hollywood couples and everyone trying to protect their assets. It's basically a document where a couple sits down before they get married and they make an agreement that in the event that, God forbid, we separate, and we don't agree on what should happen with the Jewish divorce, we are agreeing now that we're going to go to one particular religious court to handle our case, and that if the court orders one of us to give the get and we don't do that, we don't cooperate with the process, then we'll have to pay our spouse $150 a day, and that is basically to acknowledge a support obligation that's under Jewish law. So
Interesting.
the idea here
It's a workaround.
It's a workaround.
Yeah.
And the idea essentially is that by enforcing this Jewish obligation, the idea is that if you want to stay married, great. Marriage under Jewish law comes with responsibilities. So for every day that you choose to continue this marriage under Jewish law, you need to pay your spouse this support obligation. And that creates a financial incentive to deal with the get early on. And what I tell couples all the time is that the only thing you're giving up here is the opportunity to be abusive about the get later on. You have every other right you walked in here with.
It must be pretty tough for the husband to say no to that a priori before getting married, because it's not like you said, it's not a complex financial prenup. We're talking about splitting up of assets. It's basically saying, I'm not going to use this loophole, or I'm not going to use this hammer later on. So that's sensible. I don't mean to cut you off, but I want to get to some different questions that have come up with some listeners, and I want to applaud this.
Say one more thing, because I think it's important for your listeners to hear this.
Shoot.
You know, the figure that Keshet mentioned comes to $54,000 a year, but that's just the bottom figure. In other words, there's no ceiling. If a couple of great means gets married and $54,000 is nothing to them, then it could be as much as $2,000 or $5,000 or $10,000 a day. But at some point, a figure is going to bite into the finances, and it's a tremendous incentive to get the get.
Right.
No pun intended.
Get that get. Okay, I want to applaud this listener who has, when you hear what he's sharing, you'll understand that he doesn't want to share his name, but I just want to applaud you because, as we've talked about so many times over the years, the first step in dealing with trauma, in kind of evolving and getting through the other side of something extremely difficult is talking about it. And this listener shares a long message, which I will take a small part of, that I recently moved to Israel. To my great shock, and to my wife's great shock, I found out that I am a Safek Mamzer. In short, my mother did not obtain a get, and I was, quote unquote, illegitimate. I learned this at 37 years old. He goes on. This is, you guys one of you want to address what this is about? And Rabbi Shlomo called in before, kind of alluded to this issue of children being illegitimate. And I guess, how do you solve this? What is it? Why? How does it relate to tonight's program? And if you're in that situation, if you're in this caller situation, is there a solution?
I'll just begin and then yield to Keshet. So as we said before, if a woman does not obtain the get, she may not remarry without said get. But more profoundly, if she has children with another man while still halachically married to her former husband, her children become what is referred to in Hebrew as mamzerim, which should not be confused with a bastard or a child out of wedlock. It's specifically a child born to a woman who becomes pregnant from another man other than her current husband. And unfortunately, mamzerut is the most severe, let's call it spiritual congenital condition, and it has all kinds of ramifications on the child's life and the lives of their descendants. And like all other congenital conditions, it's not fear, because the child never did anything to bring this upon themselves.
So sorry, I want to interrupt just so you understand the context. I don't want to read the whole comment here, but this is someone who moved from the United States to Israel, and his parents were not religious, and got divorced, and he is not religious, as self-described, and so this has got to be a great shock, and I just want to make sure I'm getting this right. So the situation here, as I understand it, is that his mother was previously married, and then married his father
Correct.
and never obtained a get, so never actually broke the ketubah or had a proper religious divorce. And in Israel, the religious authorities now consider him illegitimate?
Well, wherever he might be as a Jew, whether Israel, America, or, Mauritius, I mean, if he is a mamzer, he's a mamzer. If he's not, he's not. And unfortunately, he is not alone. And if one most important thing could come out of tonight's program, it would be for people listening to understand that, everybody has choice about how observant or non-observant they're going to be. But when it comes to issues of marriage, divorce, and conversion, you're talking about issues that are going to bleed into the next generation and the next and the next. So yes, it's shocking to him and so many others when they find out that they're living with the real ramifications of their parents' choices. Now,
so I don't want to go too far off topic. This sounds like a whole other show, but this underlines how tragic this can be. Even if you're listening to this program, you're thinking, well, I'm not observant. It's not really up my alley, but it can affect your children, your children's children. And if they, it sounds like it's a permanent condition to be a mamzer, as you said, to be in the situation that this man is in. And is there any remedy to it, Rivka? Can he become unmamzer?
Rabbi Shlomo tried to throw this at us. He correctly cited one of the greatest gifts that Harav Moshe Feinstein of blessed memory gave this generation is that, it's kind of a backhanded, I'll just say what he said was that if the marriage wasn't halachically valid to begin with, then in Jewish law it's simply not a marriage, in which case the child born of the mom who didn't get a Jewish divorce after that initial marriage is not a mamzer because she was never married to begin with according to Jewish law. And by doing this,
so what is he then under Jewish law?
Yeah, so he freed a lot of people from this very unfortunate rubric called mamzerut in that way. So the person who's calling you from Israel needs, the first thing they need to do, I hope they've already been told this, but maybe not, they need to research what kind of marriage that first marriage was. Because if there weren't, for instance, kosher witnesses or there was some other flaw, and it's not considered a Jewish marriage, then in fact he would not be a mamzer, and I sincerely hope that is the case for him.
Another listener here, Keshet, I'm going to direct this to you.
Sure.
We're overdue. Actually, you know what? I'm going to get to that listener's question after the break. We'll be right
and if I can, actually, Bill, if I can
Can it wait for a second just to our next commercial break?
You got it.
We're on with Keshet Star and Rivka Slonim talking about the phenomenon of the Agunot, or a woman who's chained, in a sense, is not yet freed from their religious marriage. You're on equal footing, and we'll be right back.
These tears are going nowhere, baby. You've got to get yourself together. You've got stuck in a moment.
Equal Footing is brought to you in part by Mechanical Art Capital. Mechanical Art Capital provides financing to watch dealers and watch collectors in as little as 1 day. You can get money for your watch collection or your watch inventory through Mechanical Art Capital's easy buyback contracts. Go on your smartphone and put in these 3 words in your app store, Mechanical Art Capital. The whole process can take like 5 minutes. Just upload some photos of the watches, you get an offer back, and you can get your money the next day. You also have a valuable appraisal for insurance purposes. And a lot of our listeners are in the watch industry. Check out Mechanical Art Capital. You can also go to their website, mechanicalartcapital.com, and you can call as well if you want to take advantage of their overnight financing program. You don't actually have to part with your watches. You're just getting money against that inventory. The number to call is 833-209-0972. Again, that's for Mechanical Art Capital's watch financing program, 833-209-0972.
I've been caught, but I'm keeping on to.
Keshet, I did that ad real quick for you, so you wouldn't lose your train of thought. Keshet, you there?
To share, of course, with the previous caller, if they're still on, but there's an organization called ITIM, ITIM, in Israel that helps Israelis navigate sort of Jewish personal status issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would really recommend the caller reach out to them to see if they can offer some support. For the most part, though, once you're in this mamzerut status, it's really difficult. And so that's why the prevention is so important, and also making sure that when a get is given, that it's done validly and there's no concerns about how kosher, so to speak, that get is later on.
Great. You want to say the name of that organization one more time for folks that are listening?
Sure. It's called E-Team, ITIM.
E-Team. Okay. I want to get to another listener's comment. We kind of sort for the more difficult ones. We don't want to shy away from controversy. So a listener writes that we are avoiding the core issue. A lot of this is related to abusive relationships. Domestic abuse is a pervasive issue in our community, and specifically that we're putting it under the rug. Most of the men that are not giving a get are engaged in domestic abuse. Let's be real.
Should address that immediately. She didn't throw it under any rug.
I did hear an allusion to domestic abuse. Let me ask the question this way, a little bit less charged. Keshet, how many of the cases where you have an intransigent husband, or the process of getting the divorce dissolution document, the get, is kind of gobbed up? How many of the situations would you say are dynamics where there's been an abusive relationship?
I would say over 95%.
Oh, God. So this listener is right. Not that we're putting it under the rug, but that this is a core part of the issue.
It is absolutely a core part of the issue. And what I will say is a real missing piece in our community and outside of our community, too. We do not understand abuse once we move beyond physical violence. We understand that one person hitting another person is not a good thing. But when it comes to psychological abuse, I've had so many really reasonable people who will say, well, I get into fights with my husband, and, I'm married. When I get into a fight with my husband, it's not like, oh, sugar plum, would you please? Yes, there's anger in healthy relationships, but if you've not seen these relationships up close, it can be really hard to understand what non-physical abuse looks like. And what we've identified in the abuse community is that the really dangerous thing is not even physical violence. It's this thing called coercive control, which is one person wanting to dominate the other person. And when you have that, people will destroy their own lives in order to be able to control the other person. It's very dangerous. And if someone is calling me with a textbook case of domestic abuse, I will bet money that the get is going to be a problem. What we have seen, though, and I think this is so important for people to know, is that even in these situations, we've seen successful results with prenuptial agreements because they kick in early on, and abusers want to be seen as a really nice guy. They care enormously about their image.
At that point in the relationship.
So glad you said that, Kesha, because I think that adds another layer of complexity. Very often, some of these men are big donors. They're big machers. They have this public persona that they have burnished to a shine, and the community just thinks the woman must be crazy that she's making these accusations or what have you. And it becomes just another layer of abuse and tremendous pain.
We had a show, I think it was last year, and we had Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson on, who is a great educator, and a caller was bringing up the kind of inherent patriarchy, as they put it, in the Jewish faith, and he stopped the mid-sentence, and I just thought it's interesting maybe for listeners to hear. And he said, in the Talmud, it specifically says that God counts her tears when it comes to a wife who's dealing with these types of issues, and nowhere does it say God counts his tears. And there's a special place, as I understand it, within rabbinic wisdom, within Talmud, around real empathy around these issues and an encouragement to lean in. Which is what we're trying to do here tonight. Okay, you know what? Our wonderful producer, Leah, just came into the studio, and I'm a little nervous. Here we go. Usually your questions are criticizing me. What's up?
No. Hi, guys. I just, I had a question that I don't think we've touched quite in this particular way. When it comes to religious divorce, I think the majority of these divorces or marriages also have lots of children included. So my question is, what happens to these children? And does a father who withholds a get, who is abusive, have a right to see his children? Like who protects the children?
I'm so glad you asked, because when I spoke earlier about the extra level of pain and agony, so much of it surrounds the children, who are most often caught in the crossfire between the spouses. And that's another thing to think about, which is why this program is so important, which is why Keshet's organization is so important. It's so important that we educate the community as to how important that prenuptial agreement is, because there are not just women, but lots and lots of children suffering.
And I'll add on that note, too, in an ideal world, when a couple gets divorced, mom and dad sit down with a mediator on their own, whatever works, and they come up with an arrangement for the kids that they can both live with. And when that's not possible, when that doesn't happen, the next best option is for a neutral third party to make a call. So a judge, a religious court judge, an arbitrator, someone says, this is what we're going to do. And what happens sometimes is that it's not uncommon for someone to say, I'm not giving the get until or unless I get a custody arrangement that I think is fair. And that's something that can be very dangerous for children, because some of these men are not dangerous to their children. Some of them may well be. And today, it's very uncommon for a parent to not get custody. That's not typical. People have this idea that mothers get custody all the time. It's never fathers. That's really not what's happening in family courts today. And so a huge part of our message at ORA is that whatever's happening with the kids, work it out together. If you can't, allow a third party to make a decision, but don't introduce the get into a conversation about the kids, because that runs the risk of further traumatizing survivors of abuse and putting children at risk. And so we really always want to be mindful. Kids have the most to lose in this process. They are the most voiceless in this process. So their safety and their health and the best arrangement for them has to be protected. And you would be surprised how often it happens that custody is made contingent on the get being given, that they're connected. You want the get, you're going to agree to a custody arrangement that you don't think is healthy for these kids. And that's something that as a community, we really cannot allow to happen.
So we're about to run up on time. We have, as always, a lot of great questions that come in right at the end. A couple of folks have just wanted to tell you guys to continue your good work. And one listener just wrote from a 718 area code, I don't have a name here, how incredible that the Torah cares about women's rights before anyone else. Excellent program. So people are really giving you guys kudos. Just wanted to say, so you hear that on the air. We're out of time. Can you guys just in a quick soundbite, just refer people to your organizations again if they're having this issue or they know someone in the community that's dealing with this issue?
Absolutely. I'll say for us, we're ORA. Our website is www.getora.org. And you can also find us on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram. We have a Jewish divorce helpline that people call just to learn more or ask questions. And we are just a non-judgmental, safe space to get information, get advice, and really move a situation forward.
Rivka, how do they find you?
First of all, what she said. Second, I don't have a particular concentration in this. I'm a Jewish educator, and my message to your listeners is this is so important to be educated on and to act on, because as is abundantly clear, the ramifications are intergenerational, and nobody wants to do that to their children.
Amen.
Not in the present and not in the future.
Thank you both for joining us. Hope to have you on again.
Thank you so much.